The fat girl stood before the most dangerous man in the city of Detroit. "Your mother owes me money. You are the payment," she agreed, thinking no one could ever truly want her. What she didn't know was that he had been watching her for 2 years. The debt was fake. His love was real. Rachel's hands were still greasy when she pushed open the door to her shabby apartment after a 12-hour shift at the roadside diner. The smell of burnt oil and stale coffee clung to her uniform, wrapping around her like a second skin she could not shed even after stepping out of the kitchen. Every heavy footstep across the worn wooden floor was a reminder that she was living on minimum wage, just enough to keep the lights on and a few packs of instant noodles in the fridge. She was mentally counting how many were left when her mother's uneasy laugh drifted from the living room, and her heart sank. "Rachel, sweetheart, come in here. We have company." The way her mother said it wasn't normal. Denise Moore only used that syrupy tone when she was in deep trouble. And the last time Rachel heard it was when her mother had gambled away their entire rent at a gas station slot machine. Kicking off her tattered sneakers, Rachel walked slowly toward the living room, anxiety pressing against her ribs. She expected another debt collector, or maybe a new boyfriend. But what she saw in the doorway made her stop cold. 3 men in expensive suits sat on the frayed old couch as if they owned the place. The man in the center had slicked back black hair, a sharply cut face, and gray eyes that looked as hard and cold as forged steel. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but Rachel noticed the tattoo peeking from beneath the cuff of his white shirt, a snake coiled around a dagger. An image she recognized from her criminology course back in college, from the days when she used to dream of a different future. Dominic Raines, the head of Raines Security Group, a name everyone in Detroit knew but no one dared to speak aloud. Her mother sat opposite him, trembling, clutching a coffee mug with mascara-streaked tears staining her cheeks. "Mom," Rachel's voice came out smaller than she intended. "What's going on?" Dominic's gaze fixed on her, as though he could see straight through her soul. His eyes scanned her round face, her full figure, her broad shoulders, her stained uniform taking in every inch without flinching. Rachel instinctively crossed her arms, wishing she could disappear. "Rachel Moore," Dominic said, his voice soft as velvet, yet carrying a chill as sharp as a blade. "Your mother has told me so much about you." Rachel glanced between them, confusion building inside her. "What's happening? Who are they?" Mom Denise's voice cracked with a sob. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I had no choice." Dominic lifted a hand, and with that single motion her mother fell silent. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. "Your mother owes me money, Rachel. A considerable amount." His tone was calm, almost casual, as if discussing the weather. $437,000. Rachel swayed on her feet. "What, 437,000? The casino?" Her mother whispered, barely audible. "A friend said there was a sure way to win, but he lied." Dominic nodded. "And now she's lost everything." "Plus interest." She offered another way to settle the debt. Rachel clenched her fists. "I'll work. I'll take double shifts. Weekends. Whatever it takes. I'll pay it back." Dominic leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "At your current income, it would take about 43 years to repay. I am not known for my patience." One of the men beside him gave a short, mocking laugh, silenced instantly by Dominic's glance. "Then what do you want?" Rachel asked, though dread had already crept into her chest. "Your mother offered you as payment." The room spun. Rachel gripped the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "She sold me." Her mother broke into tears, begging forgiveness, but the words barely reached her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Dominic rose tall, commanding, predatory, and walked toward her with measured steps. "I don't need a servant or a mistress, if that's what you're thinking." Rachel's breath hitched. "Then what do you want from me tomorrow morning?" he said evenly. "You will become my wife. The debt will be cleared." She gaped at him. "What? No, I don't even know who you are." Dominic stepped closer, his expensive cologne mingling with the scent of danger that seemed to emanate from him. "The alternative is that your mother's body will be pulled from the Rouge River by the weekend. Your brother Tyler won't fare much better. Children of debtors rarely live long in my world." Rachel's blood turned to ice. Tyler was only 18. He has nothing to do with this. Debt runs through a family like cancer, Dominic said softly, his words cutting like glass. Unless your family becomes mine. The wife and child of Dominic Raines are untouchable even by me. Rachel turned to her mother. But Denise couldn't meet her eyes. In that instant, Rachel understood everything. Her mother hadn't just lost their future, she had put Tyler's life in danger. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could have anyone." For a brief second, something flickered in Dominic's eyes, something she couldn't name. "You underestimate yourself." Rachel Moore, soon to be Rachel Raines. He turned, his men rising immediately to follow. "Wait," Rachel called out. "I haven't agreed." Dominic paused, glancing over his shoulder. "You have until sunrise to decide. Marry me, and your family lives. Refuse." He shrugged lightly. "Then we'll see if your principles are worth your brother's life." The door closed softly behind them, leaving Rachel alone with her sobbing mother and the shattered remains of the world she once knew. Rachel stood frozen in the dim living room, where the weak yellow light cast uneasy shadows across her mother's pale, terrified face, illuminating every wrinkle carved by fear. Dominic's words still echoed in her mind like a tolling bell of doom. "Tomorrow morning, you will be my wife." No tenderness, no pity, just a transaction stated as plainly as a business deal. Not a proposal. She tried to breathe, but the air thickened in her lungs. Humiliation, panic, and despair clashed inside her, tearing at what remained of her pride like a dull blade slicing through the last layer of dignity she had left. "No," Rachel rasped, her voice rough and trembling. "You can't do this. I am not something to be bought. I'm not a piece of property my mother can trade away." Dominic turned to face her, his eyes calm, too calm, and that frightened her most of all. This was a man who could order a death with the same ease he sipped his morning coffee. "You are not property," he said evenly, his voice low and trained, controlled. "You are your mother's final choice to keep this family alive. I merely accepted." Rachel turned toward her mother, searching for a flicker of resistance. A single word to say, this was all a mistake, that it could be undone. But Denise said nothing, she only wept, her shoulders shaking like a child caught in a lie. Rachel stepped closer, her body trembling. "Mom, how could you do this to me?" Denise reached for her hand, but Rachel pulled away as though burned. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought you'd be better off, at least protected. Dominic was the only one who could save you and Tyler." Rachel turned away, unable to bear it. She thought of her brother, of Tyler's bright face lighting up whenever he proudly showed her his math grades or told a joke over dinner. He was still just a boy, innocent, untouched by the world, and now his life was being traded by the very woman who gave him birth. Dominic moved toward her slowly, without threat or force, yet his presence silenced the room as if sound itself bowed before him. "I'm not forcing you," he said. "There are two paths. 1. You marry me, this ends. No one touches you, your mother, or your brother. 2. You refuse, and the world goes on as it always does in my circles. Debtors and their families rarely meet kind endings." Rachel lifted her chin and met his icy gray eyes for the first time. "Why me? You could make my mother work off the debt. Take the house, the car, whatever's left. Why me? I'm not beautiful. I'm not special. I'm just a waitress working night shifts with unpaid bills stacked on the counter." Dominic didn't answer right away. Something flickered in his eyes, too brief to grasp but strong enough to make her heart skip. After a long silence, he tilted his head slightly, speaking with a strange, quiet gentleness. "That's what you think, not what I see." Rachel took a step back, her legs weak beneath her. Her heart pounded wildly, not entirely from fear, but from something unexplainable stirring deep within her, something she dared not name. "If I say yes," she whispered, barely audible. "What happens then?" Dominic's tone softened. "You'll be brought to my home tonight. Tomorrow morning there will be a ceremony. Private. After that, the debt disappears. Your brother will be safe. Your mother will be left alone. And you, Rachel, will begin a completely different life." Rachel gave a hollow laugh. Half disbelief, half despair. A different life. Inside a golden cage. With a man I know nothing about except that he runs Detroit's underworld. Dominic's brow furrowed. But his voice remained calm. "No life is perfect. But in my world, a promise means something. And I promise you this, I will protect you." She turned away, refusing to let him see her cry. Everything she had known was crumbling. There was no one to call, nowhere to run. Every road led to a dead end, and the only door still open was the one leading into the life of a man so feared the whole city bowed its head before him. And the most terrifying thing of all was that, somewhere deep inside, a part of her against all reason believed him. Rachel sat alone in the darkness of her small bedroom, the dim streetlight filtering through the worn-out blinds, casting faint streaks of light across the wall. Her mother had fallen asleep on the sofa after finishing nearly half a bottle of cheap liquor, her slurred apologies dissolving into the haze of alcohol and tears. The apartment was eerily quiet, only the steady ticking of the clock and the faint hiss of wind seeping through the window broke the stillness. Rachel hugged her knees by the window, her eyes drifting toward the faint horizon where the city's weak lights flickered behind a veil of mist. Her heart felt unbearably heavy, her chest gripped by an invisible hand. She had never seen her life sink this low. For years she had fought to keep her family from falling apart, working double shifts, giving up college, giving up her dreams just so Tyler could have his textbooks, so her mother wouldn't lose their apartment. Yet all of it meant nothing when everything could collapse in a single night. She couldn't shake the image of Dominic Raines's eyes cold, sharp, as if they could see through the fragile armor she had built to survive. He hadn't lied. He didn't need to. In his world, words carried the weight of law. He had given her two choices: marry him, and her family would live in safety, or refuse. And let fate take its course, an outcome that had no mercy for debtors and their bloodlines. Rachel knew it wasn't an empty threat. Dominic didn't speak like a blackmailer. He spoke like a man describing the weather, stating a truth so absolute it couldn't be challenged. She imagined Tyler being dragged out of school, beaten, or vanishing without a trace because their mother had owed the wrong man. She had heard those stories before in their neighborhood, people in debt disappearing overnight, children who never came back to class. She had never thought her own family would become one of them, nor that she herself would become the price to keep them alive. Her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms until pain replaced panic. She hated this feeling of helplessness, hated that her life now depended on the will of a man she hadn't even met until tonight. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, a faint voice whispered that Dominic Raines wasn't like the monsters she'd imagined. He hadn't killed them on the spot, though he easily could have. Instead, he had chosen another way: marriage, a bond that, in his world, meant absolute protection, and strangest of all, in his tone, in his eyes, there had been something more than power, something that felt almost familiar, as if he had known her longer than she could understand. Rachel rested her head against the cold glass, her eyes burning from sleeplessness and tears she refused to shed. She was used to sacrifice, used to carrying burdens alone, but this time the cost was everything: her freedom, Tareem's, her future. It meant giving up herself to become the wife of a man like Dominic Raines. She didn't know what he wanted from her, or why it had to be her. But one truth burned clearer than all others: if she didn't do this, Tyler would never have a chance at an ordinary life, and Rachel would rather give herself away than watch her brother be swallowed by the dark. When the clock struck 4, the first pale traces of dawn began to creep across the ashen sky. Rachel rose, walked to the tiny bathroom, washed her face, brushed her hair, and changed out of her stained uniform into an old blue dress she'd kept for special occasions. Her hands still trembled, her heart still ached, but the eyes staring back at her from the mirror were no longer those of a frightened girl. They belonged to someone who had made her choice. When the soft knock came at 6, Rachel opened the door without hesitation. Standing outside was an older woman with silver hair neatly tied back, her face kind, her eyes deep and understanding. "You must be Rachel Moore," she said gently. "I'm Gracie Whitaker, Mr. Raines's housekeeper. I've come to take you home." Rachel nodded and drew in a long, steady breath. There was no turning back now. From this moment on, her old life was over, and another door awaited her no matter what lay behind it. Rachel stepped out of the apartment with a small backpack slung over her shoulder, carrying only a few changes of clothes, an old notebook, and a framed photograph of her and Tyler grinning in their kitchen. She didn't bring much, there wasn't much to bring, but each step down the creaking stairwell felt heavier, as though she were descending out of her old life entirely. Waiting at the bottom was Mrs. Gracie Whitaker, standing beside a sleek black SUV that Rachel could never have imagined riding in. The older woman wore a neat beige suit, her silver hair coiled in a tight bun, her face composed yet softened by an unusual gentleness in her eyes. As Rachel approached, Gracie opened the car door with effortless grace, a gesture so natural it didn't feel like pity. "Please, Miss Rachel," she said with quiet courtesy. "The drive to your new home will take about 40 minutes. Would you like some water or perhaps something light to eat?" Rachel shook her head, her lips too dry for words. Gracie didn't press further. She only offered a mild smile and joined her in the car. The SUV glided through streets Rachel knew by heart. Through the window, she saw the laundromats, the little Mexican grocery stores, the red brick buildings worn by time. All of it slipped away behind them. The further they went, the more the scenery changed, aging storefronts giving way to manicured lawns, white fences, and tall trees trimmed into perfect symmetry. By the time they reached Bloomfield Hills, Rachel exhaled in disbelief. She had delivered pizzas here once, years ago, when she worked the night shift. The cobblestone streets gleamed clean under the soft gold of the streetlights. Every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Yet none of them compared to the mansion that rose before her when the SUV slowed before a tall wrought iron gate embossed with an elegant letter R. Beyond it stretched a vast estate framed by rows of trees, and at the end of the stone driveway stood a sprawling white stone residence with high roofs and gleaming glass windows catching the morning light like crystal. Gracie turned to her, her voice as calm as the dawn. "You may call this place home. If all goes well, today will be the first day of an entirely new chapter." Rachel nodded faintly, uncertain whether she believed any of it. The gates opened slowly, and the car rolled forward into another world. Men in tailored suits stood silently throughout the grounds, not speaking, only watching. Gracie seemed unbothered by their presence. To Rachel, it felt like walking under a dozen watchful eyes. When she stepped out, awkwardly clutching her worn jacket and small backpack, Gracie reached to help her, her movements deliberate but kind. There was no condescension in her gaze, only quiet assessment. "I'll show you to your room," she said softly. "Mr. Raines is attending to some matters, but we'll see you before the ceremony." Rachel followed her through the great mahogany doors into a hall so vast it made her dizzy. The ceiling soared high above, adorned with glittering crystal chandeliers, while the marble floor beneath her feet gleamed like ice. Oil paintings lined the walls in perfect symmetry, and a faint scent of lavender drifted through the air. Everything was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. No dust, no wrinkle, not a single thing out of place. Gracie led her up a sweeping spiral staircase with polished brass railings that caught the light at every curve. Their footsteps echoed softly until they reached a door at the end of the corridor. When it opened, Rachel's breath caught. The room was twice the size of her entire apartment. A wide bed draped in champagne-colored silk stood at the center. Sheer white curtains swayed gently in the morning breeze from the balcony. An open wardrobe revealed a wedding dress hanging inside ivory satin with lace trim, delicate and gleaming, and a pair of heels placed neatly beneath it. Gracie caught the stunned look on Rachel's face and said quietly, "Mr. Raines chose it himself. He wanted you to feel worthy of something beautiful." Rachel bit her lip hard. She couldn't believe that. All her life she had been judged, mocked for her weight, her poverty, her ordinariness. And yet everything in this room seemed to whisper that she was about to step into a role no one had ever imagined for someone like her. Gracie placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "A team will come soon to help you prepare. But if you feel overwhelmed, tell me. Today is special. But more than that, it's your day." Rachel nodded faintly, her throat tightening. She walked to the balcony and pushed open the doors. Below her, The garden spread out in perfect bloom, white flowers glowing under the morning sun. Though her heart was still tangled in fear, doubt, and disbelief, she couldn't deny one thing: her life had shifted. And the door that had just opened before her, whatever it led to, no longer allowed a way back. The door opened again near 8 in the morning, when sunlight had already filled the room and birdsong drifted in from the garden below. Rachel stood with her back to the window, her hands clasped tightly against her chest, as if holding on to the last fragments of calm she had left. She hadn't slept. She had spent hours sitting on the balcony, watching the sun climb higher, trying to convince herself she was awake, that none of this was some strange, distant dream. 3 women entered, each carrying tools, gowns, and an air of quiet, professional excitement. They introduced themselves politely. One was a makeup artist, one a hairstylist, and the third handled the dress and accessories. Rachel simply nodded, feeling as though she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body, a spectator trapped within her own story. They guided her to a plush armchair before a wide mirror where the morning light fell softly, revealing every delicate feature. The hairstylist began untangling the curls knotted by her restless night, smoothing them into neat sections before pinning them into an elegant updo secured with silver clips. The makeup artist worked with practiced gentleness, her hands steady and graceful, layering soft tones across Rachel's skin as though she had done this for anxious brides 1,000 times. No one mentioned the groom. No one asked about the reason behind the wedding. They simply discussed which shade of lipstick best suited Rachel's complexion, whether a touch of shimmer at the corners of her eyes might make her glow a little more. When the final sweep of color was applied, Rachel stared into the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her skin looked smooth, her eyes framed in delicate lines that made them brighter, deeper. Her round face, once a point of quiet shame, now seemed soft and luminous beneath the elegant hairstyle and pearl earrings. Rachel lifted a trembling hand to her cheek, startled by the stranger in the reflection. She no longer looked like the weary waitress who worked 12-hour shifts at a roadside diner. She looked like someone preparing to walk down an aisle, a real bride. When the dress was brought out, the room seemed to fall silent. Rachel gazed at it as though she were seeing the shape of a childhood dream she had long buried. The gown was a gentle shade of ivory, not extravagant, yet every stitch radiated quiet grace. The lace sleeves hugged her arms delicately. The waistline was tailored to perfection, and the neckline framed her full figure in a way that felt both modest and beautiful. "Mr. Rain selected this for you," the woman holding the gown said softly, her voice like a breeze. Rachel only nodded, saying nothing, though something wordless stirred within her. No one had ever chosen a dress for her before. No one had ever cared what might make her feel beautiful. She had always been the observer, the girl on the sidelines, watching others be loved. But now, someone had considered her form, her skin tone, the quiet beauty hidden beneath years of insecurity. They helped her into the dress, pulling the zipper gently, smoothing each fold of fabric with precision. The gown fit perfectly, not too tight, not too loose, as if it had been made for her alone. When the veil was pinned delicately to her hair, Rachel lifted her gaze to the mirror once more. She no longer saw a stranger, but something more profound, a different version of herself. A woman standing on the threshold of another life. Not a failure, not the overweight waitress from a forgotten neighborhood, but a bride. A woman about to become the wife of the most powerful man in the city, whatever the reason, whatever shadows lay behind it. She couldn't deny that truth. Gracie returned just as the team finished their work. She paused in the doorway, smiling softly at the sight of Rachel. "You look lovely," she murmured. "It's time, dear. Everyone's waiting in the glass garden." Rachel drew a long breath, her fingers grazing the edge of her gown, her feet pressed lightly against the floor, as if testing the weight of this new identity, not one she had chosen, but one she would bear to protect those she loved. And in that moment, as sunlight shimmered through the veil's lace, she no longer felt like she was walking into a trap. She felt as though she were stepping into a destiny she had never seen coming. Rachel descended the marble staircase slowly, the ivory silk of her gown brushing softly against the cool stone, her footsteps echoing like the quiet rhythm of something sacred about to unfold. Gracie walked beside her in silence, her eyes warm and steady, carrying the tenderness of a mother sending her daughter into a new life. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, scattering across the grand hall and setting Rachel's veil aglow like morning dew, so that she felt, for a fleeting moment, as though she were walking through a dream whose ending had yet to be revealed. The doors to the glass garden opened gradually, unveiling a scene that seemed born of a fairy tale. White flowers lined the stone path on either side, their petals glimmering under the glass ceiling that bathed the space in soft, natural light. The air was fragrant with jasmine and roses, gentle, enveloping, like an embrace. Ahead stood a small platform with a simple white-covered table, beside which the officiant waited, posture stiff, holding the wedding ledger with the solemn expression of a man entrusted with the weight of fate. On either side sat 2 neat rows of dark-suited men, about 20 in total, silent, unsmiling, their gazes fixed on the front as though watching history take shape. Rachel kept her chin lifted, even as each step made her heart stumble in its rhythm. Every pace forward was a farewell to the life she had known. Every breath was a whispered reminder that she was doing what she must. And then she saw Dominic. He stood near the altar, still and composed in a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, his white shirt collar framing the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was slicked back, his usual steel-cold gaze softened, no longer cutting but deep, contemplative. When their eyes met, the noise in Rachel's mind vanished into silence. It wasn't because he was handsome. It was because, in that instant, for the first time since they had met, she felt that Dominic truly saw her, not her body, not her weight, not the grease-stained uniform she had worn, but her, the person standing before him in all her flawed humanity. When she reached the platform, she paused, clutching the bouquet of white blooms close to her chest, her breath short and trembling. Dominic extended his hand, not forceful, not commanding, just waiting, allowing her to choose. And Rachel, without fully understanding why, placed her hand into his. His palm was warm, firm, solid, unmistakably real. The officiant began to speak, his voice wavering slightly at first. Rachel heard the words but couldn't grasp their meaning. They floated somewhere distant, muffled by the weight of her heartbeat. All she could feel was his hand holding hers. All she could see was his gaze anchoring her, steady in a world that suddenly felt too fragile to touch. When it came time for the vows, the officiant turned first to Dominic. "Mr. Dominic Rains, do you take Miss Rachel Moore to be your lawful wife? To protect, honor, and stand by her through every trial? From this day forward, for all the days of your life." Dominic didn't hesitate. "I do." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the immovable certainty of stone. Every eye in the garden shifted toward Rachel. The officiant spoke again. "Miss Rachel Moore, do you take Mr. Dominic Rains to be your lawful husband, to accept this new life beside him, and to build a future together, from this day until forever?" For a heartbeat, time stalled. Rachel thought of Tyler, of his laughter, his bright eyes, the boy who deserved a chance. She thought of her mother's tear-streaked face, of all the sleepless nights at the diner, of the silent promise she had made to herself that no one else would pay for her mother's mistakes. Then she looked back at Dominic, the man who had upended everything she knew, yet somehow stood as the only one offering her a way out of the storm. "I do." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, softly, the officiant smiled. "Then I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Rains, you may kiss the bride." Dominic stepped forward, lifting her veil with care. His hand brushed her cheek with a touch so light it could have been the wind. "Trust me," he whispered, "just for her." And then he kissed her, barely a touch, gentle as a sigh. Not possessive, not claiming, but a quiet promise. Rachel closed her eyes, not from fear or shock, but because for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. And in that fragile, luminous moment, she understood that she had crossed into a new chapter of her life, one where she was no longer the outsider, but the woman who had been chosen. After the wedding, Rachel thought things would change. Not in a fairy tale way, she had never been naive enough to expect that, but she had at least hoped for something more tangible. An explanation. A gesture. A real conversation. Instead, Dominic disappeared from her almost immediately after the ceremony. He exchanged polite words with the few witnesses present, then retreated into his office on the ground floor, the heavy wooden door closing behind him, like a silent declaration of boundaries not to be crossed. Rachel was escorted back to her room, the same one she had been prepared in that morning and from that day. No one mentioned whether they would share a room. She didn't ask, and he never said. The days that followed stretched into a slow, strange stillness, as if time itself had been diluted into something unrecognizable. Each morning, Rachel woke alone. Breakfast was served on the balcony, an elegant table set between 2 pots of lavender. The food always hot, always perfect. Prepared by the best chef in the Rains household, but Dominic was never there. Gracie visited her every morning, gentle as always, offering to take her for a walk through the garden or to the library. Rachel always smiled politely, sometimes joining her, sometimes sitting for hours on the wicker chair, watching petals drift to the ground without really seeing them. Dominic's mansion was beautiful in a cold, deliberate way. Everything was too orderly, too clean, too silent. It felt designed to impress, not to be lived in. By noon, she would wander to the koi pond at the back garden, sitting on the white stone bench overlooking the still water. Sometimes she brought a book. More often she simply sat in silence, listening to the trickle of water and the rhythmic footsteps of the guards who patrolled along the iron fences. They never spoke, never smiled, never looked directly at her. Yet she always felt their eyes tracing her every move. At first, it unsettled her. Then she grew used to it, but she never felt free. She knew she was being watched. Every step within the estate was permitted, monitored, measured, gentle though it was. The control felt no less real. It was a golden cage, quiet, polished, and inescapable. Evenings were the hardest. Dinner was served in the grand dining room, where a 12-seat table held only 2 occupied chairs, hers and Dominic's, at opposite ends. The distance between them felt vast, like a chasm neither dared to cross. Dominic always arrived on time, immaculate, courteous. He asked a few polite questions, occasionally complimented the meal if it was exceptional, but never once asked how she felt, or what she thought. Their conversations were civil, cautious, the way strangers speak when etiquette demands they pretend to know each other. After dinner, he would excuse himself to return to work, sometimes offering a soft goodnight before disappearing again behind that same door downstairs. Rachel would retreat to her own room, the silence of the mansion closing in around her like fog. 2 weeks passed this way, and Rachel began to feel herself fading. The vast house swallowed her footsteps, her thoughts, her very sense of being. There was no Tyler, no mother, no noise of the old neighborhood, no chaos to fill the emptiness. She had known poverty before, but never this kind of emptiness. Once, she tried walking toward the main gate, telling the guards she just wanted some fresh air. They didn't stop her. Yet 2 men in black suits followed closely, silent, unblinking, shadowing her with every step. She turned back after 10 minutes, not from fear, but because she understood. Her freedom now existed only within the boundaries Dominic allowed. So Rachel began to write. Each day she filled a few lines in a small notebook, not to complain, but to remember who she was. She recorded what she saw, what she heard, fragments of her brief conversations with Dominic, with Gracie, with the gardener. It was her way of holding on to truth in a place where everything felt carefully staged. And deep inside, she waited for a sign, a reason, a word that might make sense of it all. Waited for Dominic to step out from behind his walls of silence and tell her the one thing he never had from the very beginning. Why her? And whether, in this strange, impossible marriage, there was ever any trace of love at all. That afternoon, as the soft light of the setting sun spread across the garden behind the estate, Rachel sat beneath the wisteria arbor, lost in thought. When she heard footsteps, familiar ones, she turned, breath catching in her chest. Tyler stood there, hesitant but smiling, his eyes bright with a joy she hadn't seen in so long. Rachel rose instantly, rushing to him, wrapping her arms around him before she could even speak. Her little brother, the only piece of her old life left, was standing before her like an impossible dream. She didn't care how he'd gotten past the guards, or why Dominic had allowed it. All she knew was that she had missed him so deeply it hurt to breathe. Tyler hugged her back just as tightly, saying nothing for a long minute, as though he too was afraid that if he let go, she might vanish. Rachel led him into the small sitting room behind the library, the quietest corner of the house. She handed him a glass of cold lemonade, and he took a sip, glancing around cautiously before pulling something small from his jacket pocket, a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Keep this safe," he whispered, sliding it across the table. Rachel unwrapped it and froze. Inside was a small black phone, old, without a SIM card or GPS tracker. She looked up at him, stunned. "How did you get this?" Tyler met her gaze, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't just do nothing. You disappeared. Then suddenly you were married to someone no one knew, and I wasn't allowed to see you. I had to find out why. I asked around. I found a man who used to work for Dominic Raines but left years ago. He gave me this and said it's the only way you can reach the outside world without being watched." Rachel held the phone in her hand. It felt weightless, yet as heavy as the truth itself. She knew she was being monitored. Every device, every camera, every call in this house could be traced. But this was freedom, however fragile. "Tyler, do you realize how dangerous this is?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I do," he said simply, "but losing you scared me more." Rachel pulled him into her arms again, holding him tighter this time. Her throat ached. How long had it been since someone had held her without agenda or fear, since someone loved her simply because she was herself? Later, after Gracie discreetly helped escort Tyler out through a side gate, a gesture that startled Rachel with its quiet defiance, she returned to her room, her pulse still racing. She hid the phone inside the hollow space of a small photo frame on her vanity, a place no one would think to look. Through dinner, she could barely focus. Dominic was as composed as ever, his tone polite, his manner calm, though his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, as if he could sense the secret trembling behind her silence. Rachel forced her hands to stay steady as she lifted her glass. Questions churned in her mind. Had Dominic allowed Tyler's visit, or had he been unaware, and why had Gracie helped her? As if she'd been waiting for this chance all along. That night, after making sure she was alone, Rachel locked her door, drew the curtains, and retrieved the hidden phone. She switched it on. The faint glow of the screen lit up the darkness. No internet, no SIM card, only one old messaging app pre-installed. And there, waiting, was a single unread message. "We know who you are, and you deserve to know the truth. When you're ready, reply." No name, no trace. But in that moment, Rachel felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a tremor of hope. The golden cage around her had cracked. She had a choice, a way out, and for the first time since her wedding day, she was no longer completely alone. The next morning, after a restless night spent staring at the hidden phone and the unread message that still lingered on its dim screen, Rachel descended the staircase with a heavy head and heavier heart. The mansion was as quiet as ever, almost unnaturally, so only the faint chirping of birds in the distant garden and the rhythmic footsteps of guards circling the property broke the silence. Gracie had already laid out breakfast, a soft-boiled egg and a plate of warm cinnamon butter scones that filled the air with sweetness. But Rachel only touched the edge of her plate before pushing it away. Her thoughts were tangled. Tyler's visit, the phone, the mysterious message. It all felt like a door she'd been too afraid to open had suddenly swung wide. And now she stood on the threshold, unsure what waited on the other side. She was walking down the corridor leading to the back garden when she caught voices drifting from a half-open door nearby. The voices of two men she recognized immediately: Marco, one of Dominic's trusted guards, and Grant, the head of security, the same man whose eyes often carried that mix of disdain and false pity whenever they met hers. Rachel froze. Her instincts told her to move on. But then a sentence stopped her cold. The boss sure went big this time, Marco sneered. Marrying that fat nobody just to shut up her gambling addict mother. She's the kind of woman you keep in the storage room, not the living room. Grant chuckled darkly. Better that way. The more invisible she is, the fewer questions when she disappears. The words hit Rachel like ice water poured down her spine. She turned away, but tears had already burned trails down her cheeks. Each cruel syllable sliced through her sharp, deliberate, humiliating. All her quiet efforts to belong, every fragile hope that maybe Dominic saw her differently, shattered like glass. To them, she was a joke, a debt, a burden. And Dominic, did he know? Or worse? Was he the one who'd thought it first? Rachel didn't go back to her room. She went straight to Dominic's office. Fists clenched, pulse hammering in her ears. She pushed open the door with such force that Dominic looked up in shock, the pen slipping from his hand onto the desk. "Rachel," he said. But she was already standing before him, her eyes red, her voice trembling with fury. "Do you know what your men call me? Fat? Worthless. Something to be thrown into a storage room and forgotten. A woman no one would miss if she disappeared. That's what they think of me. And you, what about you?" Dominic rose from his chair, his expression shifting, the light in his gray eyes hardening. "Who said that? It doesn't matter who." Rachel shot back, her voice breaking. "What matters is that they dared to say it. Because they know what I am here, a debt paid off. Not a wife. You married me to humiliate my mother, to make a point. Not because you ever saw me as anything more. They laugh at me. And I've been sitting here pretending that maybe, just maybe, you respected me." Dominic took a slow step forward, but Rachel recoiled. "Don't," she said, voice raw. "Don't try to comfort me. Don't give me half-truths or excuses. I've already lost everything: my freedom, my dignity, even the simple dream of being wanted by someone for who I am. And you let them insult me under your own roof." For a few seconds, Dominic said nothing. His jaw tightened, the shadows in his expression deepened. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but cold enough to freeze the air. "Whoever said those words won't live long in this house." Rachel let out a bitter, broken laugh. "You don't need to punish them, Dominic. They only said out loud what you've kept buried." He took another step toward her, his hand closing around hers. "Rachel," he said quietly, "you're wrong." But she pulled away, her eyes glistening with defiance and pain. "No. For the first time, I'm not. I finally see exactly where I stand. And I won't let anyone look down on me again." She turned and walked out, her gown brushing against the sunlight spilling across the floor, leaving Dominic alone amid the silence of his immaculate office, a silence heavier and sharper than the sound of any gunfire. The argument with Dominic still echoed in Rachel's mind as she stepped into the back garden late that afternoon. She needed airspace to breathe, to think, to let the ache in her chest settle into something quieter. She hadn't seen Dominic since storming out of his office, and no one had come looking for her. The mansion was unusually still, wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than usual. Rachel followed the narrow path lined with laurel trees, her steps unhurried, almost absent-minded, until they led her to the secluded garden near the edge of the property, a quiet corner she often escaped to when the walls of the house felt too close. No guards followed her. Perhaps Dominic had ordered them to give her space after the argument, or perhaps his cold distance had returned, but no one called after her. No one appeared. The unease that crept into her chest came without warning, like a chill wind cutting through warm air. She reached the stone bench where she usually sat to read, and everything happened at once. A faint rustle behind her, a shadow lunging forward. She barely had time to turn before someone shoved her to the ground. The crack of a gunshot tore through the stillness sharp, deafening, echoing through the garden. Rachel hit the grass hard, gasping, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She felt no pain, no wound, only the weight of a body collapsing over hers. The man who had thrown himself between her and the bullet was Dominic. He lay on his side, his arm wrapped around her protectively, shielding her completely. Blood spread through his shirt from his left shoulder, blooming dark against the white fabric. Shouts erupted in the distance. Guards poured into the garden. Weapons drawn. Voices overlapping through radios and panic. But Rachel couldn't move. Her gaze locked on Dominic's face, the man who, without hesitation, had stepped into the line of fire for her. His lips pressed together against the pain, but his eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice hoarse and strained. Rachel broke down, sobbing. Not from shock, but from the brutal clarity of that moment, in all the unanswered questions, in all the confusion that had clouded her since the day they met. There was suddenly one truth she could no longer deny. Dominic had taken the bullet meant for her. He hadn't thought. He hadn't calculated. He had simply acted, and that act spoke louder than anything he could have ever said. The guards lifted Dominic, and Rachel stood quickly, clutching his arm as if afraid he might slip away. "You're hurt, don't talk," she said through trembling lips. He winced but didn't pull from her grasp. The men moved swiftly, carrying him toward the house. Gracie appeared from somewhere, wrapping an arm around Rachel's shoulders, murmuring in her ear that an intruder had slipped in with the gardening crew that morning. No one had realized he was armed, but the intent was clear. The target was Rachel. The rest of Gracie's words blurred into a haze. Rachel's mind spun, piecing together fragments that refused to fit. Who would want her dead? Because she was Dominic's wife, or because she was the weakness in his empire, the easiest way to hurt him once? She had believed she didn't matter. But now, someone had pulled a trigger to erase her, and the man she had hurled her anger at just hours ago had stepped in front of death itself to save her. As they rushed toward the mansion's medical wing, Rachel walked beside the stretcher, her hand still gripping Dominic's. His eyes were closed now, but his fingers tightened faintly around hers, as if holding on to that touch anchored him somewhere safe. She didn't know what this moment would mean, or if it would change anything between them, but something had already shifted inside her. Dominic Raines might be the feared man who ruled Detroit from the shadows, a man built from secrets and control, but to her, in that breath between life and death, he had been something else entirely. He had been the man who chose to protect her with his own life, and that truth, piercing and undeniable, cracked something open deep within her. The first fracture of trust, fragile, trembling, and real, had begun to form. Rachel sat beside the bed in the large upstairs room that had been turned into a makeshift infirmary, her eyes fixed on Dominic's still form against the white linens. The bullet had been removed, the wound at his shoulder stitched carefully. The Raines family doctor had assured her it wasn't life-threatening, though he would need complete rest for several days. Dominic lay asleep under the haze of painkillers. But even in unconsciousness, his hand hadn't let go of hers, not since they brought him in. Rachel hadn't moved either. She stayed through the afternoon, through the quiet hum of evening, through midnight, watching over him with a kind of fragile devotion, as if the world would collapse the moment she loosened her grip. When Dominic stirred, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the sky. His eyelids fluttered, slow, unfocused, until his gaze finally steadied. Rachel gasped softly as his fingers twitched around hers. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You're awake," he blinked. Saw her first, and instead of smiling or speaking, he simply nodded, a faint gesture that somehow carried relief. After a long pause, his voice came out hoarse, roughened by pain but clear. "Are you hurt?" Rachel shook her head, tears trembling on her lashes. "No, I'm fine. It's you who's hurt." Dominic's mouth curved in a faint smile, the faintest shadow of warmth crossing his features. For once, his eyes held no coldness, no guarded distance, only something raw, human, and achingly gentle. "Rachel," he said quietly, his words slow and weighted. "I owe you more than I can ever say, maybe everything." Her heart thudded harder as he went on. "I've been watching over you for nearly 2 years. The first time I saw you was at that diner in West End. Your uniform was wrinkled, your hair tied up in a hurry. You were arguing with a drunk customer, but you stood your ground. You didn't back down. You didn't even notice me there." "No one did." Rachel stared at him, speechless. Dominic's eyes met hers, unflinching. honest in a way that broke through every wall she'd built. I couldn't explain it then. Maybe because you were different. You didn't fake smiles. Didn't flatter anyone. You just kept going day by day for your family. For your brother. I sent people to keep an eye on you. To make sure you were safe. When your mother started gambling, I knew. Long before you did. Her head spun. She had suspected there were secrets in this house. But she hadn't imagined the truth went so far. Then, the debt Dominic exhaled, closing his eyes briefly before meeting her gaze again. It was real, but not like your mother said. I made it worse. Unavoidable. Because it was the only way to keep you close. And yes, I forced you to marry me. Because I was selfish. Because I wanted you near me, even though I knew you'd never choose a man like me. Rachel's fingers tightened around his hand. Part of her wanted to shout. To accuse. But another part, the part that had waited all this time for honesty, fell silent. There was no cruelty in his words now. Only confession. Only truth stripped bare. I kept my distance because I was afraid. He continued. Voice lower now. Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid that if you ever saw what kind of man I really was, you'd leave. So I told myself keeping you safe was enough. That if I stayed away, if I gave you comfort and protection, it would be enough. He paused, breath catching slightly, then pressed her hand tighter. But I was wrong. I can't protect you by keeping you outside my heart. When I saw that gun pointed at you, nothing else mattered. There was only you. Rachel didn't realize she was crying until a tear slipped down her cheek and fell onto his hand. She lowered her forehead against his fingers, her voice trembling. You don't have to be perfect. Dominic, just be real with me. Dominic lifted his other hand, weakly brushing away her tears. His voice dropped to a whisper, so soft she almost missed it. I love you. Rachel, I loved you before you even knew my name, and I will keep loving you for as long as you'll let me. Something broke open inside her like a dam long cracked, finally giving way. It wasn't just his words, but the weight behind them, the quiet truth of his sacrifice, the unguarded way he said her name, every doubt, every wound, every cold distance between them dissolved in that moment. Not because he had confessed love, but because, for the first time, she believed she was loved, not out of debt, not out of pity, not out of power, but because she was herself. And for the first time in a very long time, Rachel felt chosen, not claimed, not owned, but seen, chosen by a man who had finally learned that love, in its truest form, was the act of giving without demanding anything in return. Rachel remained by the bed, her hand still cradled in Dominic's, her heart stumbling over itself. Unable to find its rhythm after the words he had just spoken, she looked at him for a long, silent moment. As if trying to memorize every line of his face, the man she had once believed incapable of tenderness, now lying before her, stripped of all his armor, fragile yet utterly sincere. He had said he loved her, not as a command, not as possession, but as something real quiet, steady, and so deeply human that it pierced through every scar she carried. Rachel lifted her hand and brushed it gently against his cheek, where tension and pain mingled with a softness that seemed new, unfamiliar. Dominic didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, eyes closing like a man finally rescued from his own darkness. The room fell into a hush so complete that even the sound of their breathing seemed sacred. They didn't need words anymore. The small tightening of fingers, the meeting of eyes, the steady warmth of their joined hands, each gesture spoke what their voices could not. Dominic looked up at her again, unguarded now. I don't expect you to forgive everything I've done, he said quietly, each word carrying the weight of confession. But if there's even a small part of you that believes I can be better, please, don't turn away. Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his, a touch so light it felt like air. It wasn't a kiss born of passion. It was one born of release, gentle, trembling, yet filled with everything they had both held back for too long. Dominic's fingers tightened around hers, and then he kissed her back deeper. Certain, the kind of kiss that asked for nothing, yet promised everything. It carried no words, but it echoed louder than any conversation they had ever had. It was forgiveness. It was truth. It was two wounded souls finding shelter in each other. The walls Dominic had built around himself for years crumbled in that instant. And the emptiness inside Rachel, the ache of never being chosen, never being truly seen, began to fill with something warm, slow, and real. When they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead against his, her tears glistening but her smile steady. Dominic's voice broke softly between them. "I don't need anything else. Just you. Here." Rachel nodded, her words barely more than a breath. "I'm not staying because of the debt, or because I'm afraid. I'm staying because I love you." Too. The admission unlocked something that had been sealed between them for so long. Dominic's grip on her hand tightened, as if the fear of losing her might make the moment vanish. But she didn't leave. She stayed willingly, wholly, outside the tall window. The sky deepened into dusk. The last golden light of day fell across the room, wrapping them both in a soft amber glow. It wasn't silence born of emptiness anymore, but of peace, the kind that comes after the storm has finally passed. Rachel glanced toward the fading light, then back at Dominic, her eyes luminous yet calm. "Can we start over?" she whispered. Dominic smiled, faint but genuine, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "Tomorrow." Rachel shook her head, leaning down to kiss him once more. Longer this time, fierce in its tenderness. "No. Starting now." And in that moment when the past was finally laid to rest and their truths had been spoken, they were no longer two people lost in separate worlds. They were two halves of the same story, fitting together at last, bound not by obligation or fear, but by the fragile, miraculous choice to love and to begin again. 2 days later, everything seemed calm again. Dominic was walking now slowly, carefully, his shoulder still bandaged but healing well. Rachel moved through the house as though waking from a long sleep. Her world softened yet sharper somehow. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt heavy, but alive. Dominic took her on a walk through the gardens for the first time without guards trailing behind them. They talked. They laughed. And for the first time in her life, Rachel felt what it meant to be loved without condition, without payment, without fear. Yet just as peace began to feel real, the first cracks appeared in its surface. That afternoon, while she was in the small study near the library, Rachel noticed her secret phone vibrate, the one hidden inside the photo frame, the one Tyler had given her. A single message appeared on the dim screen. "Your brother's been in an accident. He's in the ER. Lakeside Hospital." Her heart stopped. She stood so quickly that the chair scraped against the floor. No follow-up message. No name. No room number. But the hospital was real and Tyler studied nearby. Panic and instinct fused into one blinding thought: "He needs me." She bolted from the room, her pulse thundering. She didn't stop to find Dominic. She didn't tell Gracie. All that existed in her mind was the image of her brother, hurt and alone. Outside, the courtyard was strangely quiet. No guards stood at their usual posts. Most of the household staff were gathered somewhere near the back, where Dominic was holding a meeting with his advisors. At the front gate, a sleek black car idled with its engine running. The driver, dressed in a black suit and dark glasses, stepped forward and opened the door. "Lakeside Hospital?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded once. That was all she needed. Rachel climbed in, and the door clicked shut, locked from the inside. The car pulled away fast. Too fast. At first, she told herself it was just urgency, that maybe Dominic had arranged this without her knowing. But when the familiar city streets gave way to narrower roads and the driver took a sharp turn toward the outskirts, the dread in her stomach began to twist into something colder. Rachel leaned toward the tinted window, nothing but her own reflection staring back. She tried the door handle. It didn't move. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, in voice trembling. "This isn't the way to the hospital." The man said nothing. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the wheel. The car accelerated. Rachel pounded her fists against the window, shouting, but her cries vanished into the hum of the engine. After several desperate minutes, the car veered off the main road onto a dirt path lined with dead trees and stopped abruptly in front of an old warehouse, half collapsed and swallowed by weeds. The driver stepped out, opened her door, and yanked her roughly to her feet. Rachel struggled, kicking and pushing, but he shoved her inside before she could catch her breath. The air was damp, reeking of rust and dust. Her hands were bound with plastic ties behind a cold metal chair, tape pressed hard across her mouth. Her pulse roared in her ears. When her vision adjusted, a shadow moved in the far corner. Footsteps echoed slowly on the concrete. A man emerged. Rachel froze. She knew that face, the sharp smile, the scar near his temple. Novak, Dominic's old enemy, thought to be long gone after a failed deal years ago. But here he was, alive, whole, and looking at her like a predator finally reclaiming his prey. "Well," he drawled, his voice low and rough with satisfaction. "Look who we have here. Mrs. Rains." His smirk widened. The one thing Dominic couldn't keep safe. The final gift he'll lose. Rachel thrashed against the restraints, her muffled scream tearing through the tape. Fury and terror clashed inside her chest. Her mind raced, not just with fear for herself, but for Tyler. Was he truly hurt, or had they used his name as bait? Was he already caught somewhere, or waiting? Terrified, she didn't know. All she knew was that she had walked straight into a trap laid long before she even received that message. And as the truth settled like ice in her veins, Rachel realized the fragile peace she and Dominic had built. The laughter, the hope, the love that had begun to bloom was now hanging by a thread, ready to be torn apart in one cruel, calculated move. The sharp pain at the nape of Rachel's neck jolted her awake. The damp, oily, metallic air of the warehouse hit her like a wave and made her stomach turn. She blinked to focus in the dim light of a single bare bulb swinging above the concrete floor. Her hands had been bound tightly behind her with plastic zip ties, her feet fastened with a coarse rope wound around the leg of a rusted metal chair. Her mouth was no longer taped, but her throat was so parched she could not force a sound. A clinking noise came from the shadows, then footsteps. She held her breath and watched a shape approach. Novak. He filled the space with the swagger of a man who considered the world his, cloaked in a battered leather jacket, his presence as broad and invasive as the building itself. He stopped in front of her and crowed with scorn, circling her like a man appraising spoil. "Awake, Mrs. Rains," he sneered, the contempt in his voice raw. "I used to think Dominic Rains was untouchable. Then he fell in love, and when a man like him loves, he weakens. You are that weakness." Rachel lifted her head, her voice hoarse but steady. "You won't beat Dominic. You don't know him." Novak barked a dry laugh. "Know him, I was closest to him once. I know him better than you think. That's why I know where to strike." Her mind raced, inventorying the room, an old rotting table behind her, a cluster of rusty tools in the left corner, a high narrow window leaking a strip of light, a tarp flapping with each stray gust. Novak leaned close, his tone dropping to a venomous whisper. "I'll let Dominic hear you beg. That will be his last gift." Rachel smiled without warmth, the smile of someone who had chosen steel over panic. "You think you know Dominic, but you don't know one thing he does not surrender. Neither will I." Novak looked taken aback by her composure, then barked a command and left 2 men to stand guard before vanishing through the heavy iron door. The moment he disappeared, Rachel began to move. She tilted the chair and inched it back toward the old table, each shift making the rope bite into her ankle until pain flared. But she did not stop. When the chair was close enough, she scraped the metal leg along the table's edge, feeling with her fingertips for any sharp point, any nail that might free her. Finally, something poked through beneath the splintered wood. She worked the zip tie against that jagged edge, rubbing and grinding with numb hands, while sweat trickled from her temples. The guards lounged at the doorway, one glancing back occasionally, the dim light hiding her efforts. The tie loosened. Then with a sudden snap, it gave way. Her hands stung from the scrape but were free. She kept her head bowed, feigning sleep, and slid her fingers toward a thin iron rod at the table leg. Just then, one of the guards approached, suspicion on his face. Rachel waited until his bend, then launched herself like a coiled spring. striking the rod into his jaw with every ounce of fury and adrenaline she could muster. He crumpled. Howling, the other guard lunged. But Rachel rose unsteadily. Eyes blazing. In that instant she was no longer the frightened girl led into a trap. She was a wife. A sister. A fighter who refused to be reduced. The warehouse door still stood shut. The fight was far from over, but she had bought them time. And in that growing clarity, she understood the battle had only just begun. The first guard collapsed onto the concrete with a strangled cry, blood streaking down his forehead from the brutal strike of Rachel's iron rod. The second one recoiled, startled, then charged forward with a snarl of rage. Rachel didn't wait. She swung the broken chair between them as a shield, dodged his lunge, and brought the bloodied rod down again. It missed his face by an inch but caught his shoulder hard enough to send him staggering sideways. That was all she needed. She darted past him toward the side of the warehouse where she'd glimpsed a narrow door, but it was padlocked from the outside. A thick, rusted clasp that refused to yield. Rachel gritted her teeth, her hands trembling as she searched the wall for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on a wooden shelf littered with tools. A large screwdriver lay there, old but sharp. She seized it just as the guard lunged again, grabbing her by the throat and squeezing until black spots bloomed in her vision. Summoning every last shred of strength, she drove the screwdriver into his shoulder. He howled, the grip on her neck breaking. Rachel stumbled back, coughing, her lungs burning, the handle slick with blood in her fist. The man dropped to his knees, writhing, unable to rise. The air was thick now, heavy with sweat, rust, and the iron tang of blood. Rachel's pulse hammered like a war drum. She couldn't stop. She didn't know how many men were outside or whether Novak was coming back, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity: if she didn't get out now, Dominic would lose her. Tyler would lose his sister, and everything they had fought to build would vanish. She turned back to the side door, jammed the screwdriver into the padlock, and twisted with shaking hands. Metal scraped metal. Time stretched thin. Then click, the lock snapped open. Rachel burst outside. Sunlight flooded her vision. Blinding, searing. She blinked rapidly, orienting herself. Ahead lay a dirt road winding through the thinning trees. Empty and silent almost. A few 100 yards away, she heard the low rumble of an engine. A truck. 2 men stood beside it, smoking, their backs turned. Rachel didn't think. She ran. The scrape of her shoes on gravel betrayed her, and one of the men spun around, shouting, "She's loose." A gun came up. Rachel dove into the trees to her right just as a shot cracked through the air, splintering branches above her head. She fell, scrambled up again, and kept running. For the first time in her life, fear didn't paralyze her, it fueled her. Each stride, each gasp, was defiance itself, proof that she would not be broken. Behind her came shouting, pounding feet, more gunfire. She crashed through a thicket, slid down a muddy slope, and landed hard in a shallow drainage ditch. Mud clung to her arms and legs, her knees were torn and bleeding, but she pushed forward on hands and knees until she found a narrow path twisting through the underbrush. Luck, or fate, guided her steps. Moments later, she broke through to a paved road at the forest's edge. A dark blue pickup was approaching slowly in the distance. Rachel staggered into the middle of the road, waving both arms. The driver braked hard. A man in a security guard's uniform jumped out, eyes wide with shock. Rachel could barely breathe. "Please," she gasped. Voice raw. "I was kidnapped. Take me to the police or call Dominic Raines." The man didn't hesitate. He helped her into the cab and slammed the door, the engine roaring as they sped toward the city. Rachel slumped against the seat, her clothes soaked in blood and mud, her body trembling, but her eyes were fierce, unbroken. She had survived. No one had saved her this time. She had fought her way out. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Novak would not stop. Dominic was surely already hunting. The real war had yet to begin. But Rachel was ready now, no longer the frightened girl who once accepted her fate. but a woman who finally knew her worth and would fight to protect what was hers. The pickup truck pulled up at a security checkpoint on the city's edge, the outpost where Dominic's men kept watch around the clock. And Rachel nearly collapsed when she saw the Rain's crest stamped on the steel wall. The driver leapt out and shouted to the guards. And within moments, 2 black-clad men with weapons surrounded the vehicle and recognized her, one of them radioing Dominic at once. And in less than 10 minutes, Dominic arrived in an armored SUV, his eyes blazing with cold. Razor-sharp fire. When the door opened and he saw Rachel mud-streaked and bloodied, he said nothing. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a fierce, crushing embrace as if afraid that any slack in his grip would make her evaporate. And Rachel buried her face in his shoulder, not crying, not trembling, simply drained into exhaustion and the relief of being finally safe. There was no time, however, for tenderness after the private doctor tended to Rachel's wounds, and she stubbornly refused to go to a hospital until the danger had passed. Dominic turned to his head of security, and his voice rang like steel as he issued orders to identify the perpetrators. Ping every observation post. Locate the warehouse. Novak will not leave the city until his plan is complete, and Rachel sat in the back of the car watching him command with clenched lips. Holding his hand as the convoy rolled out, Dominic glanced back at her, a softness touching his gaze for the briefest instant. "I will not let this happen again," he promised. "This time I do more than protect you. I will end it all." As dusk fell and the convoy crossed the suburbs, surveillance drones locked onto the warehouse where Rachel had escaped. But they did not know that Novak had prepared for this. He expected Dominic to come. And deeper in the woods, another barn had been readied as a kill zone. Dominic did not wait for anyone to open a door for him. He was the first out, body armor under his coat and his weapon steady in his hand. Rachel held back by safety orders, though her eyes tracked every step like an omen. Inside the timbered shed, flashlights cut across rotten beams as Dominic and his 4 best shooters slipped forward. Their steps muffled on the cold concrete. Then a hail of bullets stove down from above. Dominic yelled, spread out and rolled to the right behind a concrete pillar as 2 of his men took rounds. One, falling, the other crawling for cover. And Dominic's heart turned to ice. Novak was not merely kidnapping his wife. He meant war. A shadow slipped down a rear corridor, and Dominic raced after it. Rounding a narrow bend, just as Novak leapt from the gloom with a gun leveled, Dominic landed a savage punch that sent the weapon flying, and the 2 men crashed together in a violent tangle beneath strobing light and distant gunfire. Novak a raw, brutal force, while Dominic was stubborn and lithe. And though a hook from Novak split Dominic's lip and blood ran, he did not stop. He rose, swung the butt of his firearm into Novak's temple, and the other man howled and staggered, blood seeping down his collar. But Novak drew a dagger and plunged it into Dominic's abdomen. The pain ripped through Dominic like tearing. He stumbled back, clutching the wound. Novak moved to finish him. Then a gunshot cracked, and a bullet lodged in Novak's biceps. Dominic turned and saw Tyler standing there, hands shaking around a gun, but his eyes hard. The boy Rachel's heart had raced to save had been found and brought by Dominic's men. And Dominic seized the moment, wrenched the dagger away, and drove it down into Novak's leg until the man crumpled, while Dominic swayed, blood pouring from his hip. And still he turned toward the place where Rachel had been brought in and, voice raw with pain but unwavering, said, "I told you, no one takes you from me." Before his knees buckled, yet his grip on the pistol remained unrelenting, as if he would defend her one more time, even at the cost of his life. Rachel screamed when she saw Dominic collapse in a pool of blood, his eyes dimming yet still locked on her as if trying to finish an unspoken promise. She didn't hesitate, though Dominic's men hadn't fully cleared the warehouse and gunfire still echoed in the distance. Rachel ran to him like a storm unleashed. Gracie tried to hold her back, but instinct had taken over the pure, primal need to protect the man she loved. She dropped to her knees beside him, trembling hands cradling his head, her lips quivering as she saw the dark stain spreading from the knife wound in his side. Dominic was conscious but fading fast, his breath ragged, and in his eyes flickered not command or control, but a deep, human fear that he might not have enough time to stay. "Look at me," Dominic, don't close your eyes, Rachel whispered, pressing her palms hard over the wound as if her faith alone could stop the bleeding. The blood seared her fingers, warm and metallic, but she didn't flinch. Tyler and one of the guards shouted for the doctor, their voices distant, swallowed by the storm of her heartbeat. In that moment, there was no warehouse. No chaos, only Rachel and Dominic suspended in the fragile space between life and loss. She bent close, one hand cupping the back of his neck as his blood slowed under her touch. "Do you remember when you told me you loved me?" she choked out. "Now it's my turn. I'm not letting you go. Do you understand? I won't allow it. We haven't even lived the life we were supposed to have yet." Dominic tried to smile. Blood traced the corner of his mouth. But the faint curve of his lips made Rachel grip his hand tighter. She turned sharply toward the men around her, voice clear and commanding, a voice that no longer belonged to the fragile girl fate had toyed with, but to someone who had seized control of destiny. "Bring me a trauma kit and call the helicopter. He needs to be in surgery now." The men froze for a breath, startled by the authority in her tone, then scrambled to obey. They were used to taking orders from Dominic, but now it was as if a second Dominic stood before them, not forged in power or violence, but in love and courage. When the doctor arrived and began working to stem the bleeding, Rachel stepped back just enough to give space, but she never released his hand. She turned her gaze across the warehouse to the far corner where Novak sat bound, his face smeared with blood. She walked toward him slowly, eyes locked on his. "You thought kidnapping me would be enough to break Dominic," she said coldly. "You were wrong. I'm not the girl who was sold to pay a debt anymore. I'm Rachel Raines. And from this moment, anyone who comes after my family will answer to me first." Novak spat blood and laughed weakly. "What are you in this world?" Really, Rachel took another step closer, her stare unwavering. "I'm the one Dominic chose to love and protect. But more than that, I'm the one who dares to love him back and to fight. I don't need to be born into this world to rule it. I only need to know I will never bow to anyone." The room fell silent. Every soldier turned toward her, no longer seeing the boss's wife, but a queen rising fierce, defiant, unbreakable. When the helicopter blades thundered above the trees outside, Rachel returned to Dominic's side and leaned close, whispering, "I'm here, and I'm staying. No one will take me from you, not Novak, not fate, not the past." Dominic's fingers tightened weakly around hers, just enough to let her know he heard. And in that touch, she found her vow. She would fight for him until he could stand again beside her, through every shadow they had faced together. For in that moment, Rachel was no longer a wife bound by debt. She had become the living, unyielding heart of the Raines Empire. The medical chopper's rotors shrieked as they sliced through the blood-thick air and the smell of gun smoke. And Rachel stayed on her knees beside Dominic, gripping his hand as if releasing it would let his soul slip across that thin border between life and death. The medics tumbled out with stretchers, kits, and potent hemostatic agents, and they lifted him with the urgent precision of people who move only when a life hinges on it. Rachel, trailing step for step until a nurse signaled she could not accompany him into the cabin, she watched, rooted, as they strapped him in, his gaze dim and frail but still straining to find her one last time like an unfinished vow. And when the chopper rose, she felt her heart split but held steady, because there was one more thing she had to do. In the shadowed corner of the warehouse, Novak sat still, bound and blood-slick, a sneer half formed on his lips. And when Rachel turned back, he lifted his head and mocked. "You think he'll live? Dominic Raines is strong. But he's not immortal. You're just a fat pawn. Loved on a whim." Rachel said nothing. Her presence was answer enough, but Tyler, who had been held and tricked, and who had watched his sister taken and felt powerless, stepped forward with a new fire in his eyes. He was no longer the child who curled into Rachel's shoulder to cry. He had grown into a young man who saw the enemy, who had raised a hand against the sister he adored, and the man who had given him a sense of family. And Tyler stooped and picked up a long rebar rod, rusty and heavy, lying discarded on the floor, heavy enough to kill if struck true. "Tyler, you don't have to do this," Rachel pleaded, voice low. "He'll pay by law or by Dominic's reach." But Tyler did not look away. He walked deliberately toward Novak while the captive laughed. "Kid, what do you think you can do? You think you can kill a man?" Tyler stopped a few paces off and whispered so only Novak could hear. "I don't think. I know. I saw my sister nearly die because of you. I saw Dominic fall because you wanted to prove some sick power game. I know some people never stop unless they are finished." Then without a beat he swung, driving the rod into Novak's temple with the clean, horrible finality of a sentence pronounced. Novak slumped, motionless, and not a single man in the warehouse moved to stop him. The silence that followed was not stunned complicity, but recognition this was not mere revenge. It was an end, a period closing chapters of loss, torment, and bloodshed. The rebar clanged to the floor like a long exhale. Tyler stood breathing hard, hands shaking from what had poured through him, and Rachel stepped into his arms, holding him without words so he would know she understood. She was not proud that her brother had taken a life, but she knew that sometimes the cost of coming of age is paid in the hardest currency. And now, by whatever crooked path, her family had defended itself against the last lingering darkness. 6 months had passed since that night in the blood-soaked warehouse, 6 months since Rachel Raines had held Dominic, his body slick with blood, in her arms, and since her brother's hands had been stained with the cold blood of the man who had nearly destroyed them both. Time had not erased the memories, but it had changed everything, including Rachel herself. The woman who once lived quietly in the shadows of shame and hurt had become someone no one quite recognized anymore. In the Raines mansion, where once only Dominic's voice had commanded obedience, another voice now carried through the marble corridors, softer, steadier, impossible to ignore. Rachel walked those halls with her hair swept neatly back, a tailored black suit shaping her frame, her gaze clear and unwavering. Gone was the timid hesitation in her eyes. Now, every servant and guard bowed their heads to her before they even spoke Dominic's name. When Dominic awoke from surgery, it took nearly 2 months for him to fully recover. Through every hour of it, Rachel never left his side. She learned how to read financial files, studied intelligence reports, and slowly took over the reins of his empire while he was still confined to bed. Gracie, the aging housekeeper who had raised Dominic, became her teacher, showing her how to read people without words, how to spot a lie by the flicker of an eye, how to know friend from enemy in a room where everyone smiled. And Rachel learned fast. The past being belittled, treated as a possession, was no longer a wound. It had become fuel, power. The foundation for the woman, no one in the underworld now dared to underestimate. Her body changed too. No more hurried steps. No more trying to make herself small beneath other people's gaze. When Rachel entered a meeting, silence followed, not out of fear, but out of respect. She had shed weight, not for beauty but as an act of self-honor, proof of discipline and balance. Her voice no longer trembled. It carried both the gentleness of a wife and the authority of a leader. When she looked at someone now, they saw both warmth and steel, the grace of love and the clarity of command. Tyler had changed as well. After the incident, he withdrew from school for a while, training directly with Dominic's most trusted men. He learned to fight, to investigate, to stay calm when the world around him was chaos. Rachel never pushed him, but she watched, and he, in turn, worked tirelessly to become strong enough to stand beside her, not behind her. As for Dominic, though still the head of the Raines empire, he no longer carried the weight of everything alone. He began to share decisions with Rachel not because he was weakened, but because he knew she was no longer his shadow. She was his equal, his other half in every sense. On restless nights, he sometimes woke from a nightmare to find her sitting beside the bed, reading quietly under the soft amber light. He would ask why she was still awake, and she would smile faintly, answering, "Because there's still so much to learn, enough so no one will ever take you from me again." 6 months, one turning of the seasons, one full circle. And within that circle, Rachel no longer sought love or approval from anyone else. She had found both within herself, in the old wounds, in the weakest moments, in the fire and the blood. Each morning when she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a leader, Rachel Raines. And she was ready for whatever waited beyond the horizon. The summit of the 5 great Mafia families of the East Coast took place in an old mansion deep in the Catskill Mountains, a place without signals, cameras, or any chance of spies slipping through. Such meetings were rare, reserved for moments when the balance of power in the underworld shifted. And this time, every gaze was fixed on Dominic Raines. What none of them expected was that Dominic would not walk into the room alone. When the heavy oak doors swung open, Rachel was beside him. She wore a pearl gray suit, her hair swept into an elegant bun, her eyes calm and unflinching as they swept across the faces gathered around the long velvet-draped table. Some eyebrows lifted. A few men smirked, but no one spoke. Dominic took the head seat, the place reserved for the man who currently held the most power. Rachel sat at his right, not as a companion, but as a counterpart. Though the meeting had been called to discuss territory divisions after Novak's fall, everyone knew the true center of gravity that day was Dominic and the woman beside him. Vito Mancini was the first to speak, his voice deep but careful. "I heard your wife escaped Novak's men herself, and even coordinated the counterstrike that stopped his reinforcements. Is that true?" Dominic said nothing. Rachel spoke instead, her voice steady. "I don't need anyone to romanticize what happened. I'm not a warrior, but when survival is the only option, you learn how to fight. And when it comes to protecting family, I don't wait for someone to save me." Silence followed. A thick, weighted silence, not of doubt, but of acknowledgement. Luca Romano lifted a glass of wine, studying her with faint amusement. "Dominic, bringing a woman into a meeting like this, it's not our tradition." Dominic turned his head toward Rachel, then looked back at the others. "I've never cared for tradition when it no longer fits the times. For the past 6 months, Rachel has run half of my network while I was in recovery. She didn't just protect me, she kept the entire Northern Territory stable. I didn't bring her here to make a statement. I brought her here so you understand from now on. When you speak to me, you speak to her too." The silence cracked. Men shifted in their seats. Some nodded. Some exchanged quick glances. Rachel's gaze moved across each of them, not with arrogance, not with challenge, but with something rarer poise. The kind that comes not from power, but from pain survived. Every man in that room knew her story, the overweight girl sold by her mother to pay a debt, married off to a mafia boss, the woman who had escaped one of New Jersey's coldest blood dealers, the wife who had bled for her husband and declared in a warehouse full of corpses that no one would take Dominic's life while she still breathed. Now she sat before them silent, composed, unshakable, a living reminder that strength could be born from the very wounds meant to break you. The discussion moved on borders redrawn, collapsed money fronts reassigned, the vacant southern routes once ruled by Novak redistributed. When Rachel proposed diverting a portion of their offshore profits into legitimate investment funds to shield against federal audits, the room went still, then slowly nodded. It was a strategy Dominic had never used. Cautious, visionary, impeccably reasoned. Every man there recognized that the woman beside Dominic didn't just belong at the table. She had earned it. When the meeting adjourned, they filed out one by one handshakes, polite farewells, lingering looks of respect. Vito was the last to approach Rachel. He placed a hand over his chest and inclined his head slightly. "My family has lived in the shadows for 3 generations. I've never seen anyone like you. You don't need a gun to make men listen. We listen because we know once you step into this world, you don't step out. You belong here now." Rachel smiled, not in triumph, but in quiet certainty, the smile of someone who has finally found her rightful place. Outside, on the balcony, overlooking the mountains, the wind carried the scent of pine and rain. Dominic slipped his arm around her waist, his voice low and warm against the cold air. "I once thought I was saving you from a dark life, but it was you who brought me somewhere I never thought I could go." Rachel leaned into him, eyes drifting toward the valley below, where the world spun on chaotic, unending, but within her there was peace, because now she no longer stood behind anyone. She was part of the power, and, more than anything, she was herself. The sunset poured gold across the peaks of the Catskills, bathing the balcony in a calm so profound it felt sacred. The autumn wind brushed lightly over Rachel and Dominic's shoulders, tender as the sigh of a chapter closing. Dominic's hand rested at the small of her back. The sharpness once living in his eyes had softened into peace. Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart quiet as still water. Every storm, every wound, every bruise that once refused to heal had become the bedrock of something enduring. They hadn't merely survived, they had transcended. Not through violence, not through power, but through persistence, faith, and a love that should not have existed in a world built on blood and control. From inside, Tyler stepped onto the balcony, the shy boy now grown tall, his gaze clear and steady. He smiled at them, settling into the chair by the railing, legs casually draped over the edge as if this had always been home. And in truth, it was not just the house, but the feeling, the rare peace of knowing one's heart finally belonged somewhere, in the underworld, where fear and dominance ruled all. The love between Dominic and Rachel was the last thing anyone expected, yet it was the very impossibility of it that made it extraordinary. A woman once sold like property to pay a debt, and a man who had lived his life wielding power in darkness they had met, collided, hurt each other, and somehow healed each other. Their love was not perfect or sweet. It began with deceit and resentment, but the cracks were what made it real. Because true love isn't about who is flawless, it's about who stays when everything falls apart. Rachel stayed, Dominic stayed, and together, they walked through the fire. This story isn't just a love tale woven through blood and power. It is a quiet lesson in choice. You may be born in darkness, but how you live, love, and believe determines whether you belong to the light or are lost forever. Rachel never changed herself to be loved. She loved herself first, and the world had to learn to meet her at that truth. She refused to let anyone else define her worth. That, more than anything, was her triumph. If you're watching this and something in Rachel and Dominic's story stirs something deep within you, pause for a moment. Look at your own life. Have you ever been judged? Have you ever believed you weren't enough or unworthy of love? Then remember this. You don't need permission to live a life of worth. You are the first person who must believe it. And like Rachel, if you dare to stand up and face your fear, you will discover that you are far stronger than you ever imagined. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Underworld Love Stories so you won't miss the next one. Like and share this video to help spread a message of love and inner strength. And please leave a comment below. Who did you see yourself in, Rachel or Dominic? Or did some moment in this story remind you of someone you once loved? Or a memory that never left you? I'd love to hear from your heart because that's what keeps every story alive. Thank you for staying with us to the end. I wish you good health, a joyful life, and peace in every new day. Until next time, from all of us at Underworld Love Stories, farewell, and see you soon.